Hello, today I welcome you to the 6th lecture on EU-Russian relations, and we are going to talk about the legal framework of EU-Russian relations. In particular, we will discuss partnership and cooperation agreement. But before we do that, I would like to briefly address the history of EU-Russian relations before the partnership and cooperation agreement emerged. In 1963, the European communities issued the first memorandum to the Soviet Union calling for normalization of the relations. But the Soviet Union responded that if it had to recognize the European communities, then the European communities had to recognize the Comecon, the economic bloc of the Soviet countries at the time. And of course, it was unacceptable for the European communities, and therefore discussions stalled. In 1970, the Soviet Union published a number of arguments why the European communities were bound to collapse. And, well, the European communities did not collapse. In 1973, in fact, the Soviet Union and the European communities came into direct contact without mutual recognition of each other. That happened as a result of the negotiations of the Helsinki Final Act, where the second basket, the economic cooperation, was signed not by individual member states of the European communities, but by the European communities as a whole. Moreover, the European communities also introduced a common external tariff in relations to the Soviet Union, and therefore somehow the Soviet Union had to deal with the communities. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev for the first time said that an asymmetric treaty was possible, and that led to the abandonment of the Soviet argument. And in 1988, the European communities and the Comecon signed a joint declaration where they recognized each other, and that opened a way for the European communities to conclude separate agreements with Central and Eastern European countries. As a result, in 1989 in Madrid, the European Council, in fact, stated the necessity of coordinating political and economic issues of cooperation with the Soviet Union and with Eastern Europe. And in December 1989, the Soviet Union concluded its first ever agreement with the European communities. At the same time, the European Union started preparing a program of technical assistance to the post-Soviet countries, and in 1991 the program, which became known as TASIS, Technical Assistance to the CIS countries, was launched. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, parties started negotiating Partnership and Cooperation Agreement in 1992, soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union on the one hand, and the emergence of the European Union to be on the other hand. Both the European Union and Russia were in the state of transformation. So the EU was forming a new political identity. Russia was looking for a new role in the international arena, but definitely both shared the desire to have high profile relations. Both sides were ready for compromises, and both sides were uncertain as to the nature of future relations. The negotiations of the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement didn't take long, in fact. A draft treaty was prepared already in 1994. But in fact, what the parties did, they took as a point of departure the agreement between the Soviet Union and the European communities. And then they added some provisions on political cooperation, and in fact, put an update which was related to the Maastricht Treaty in the EU's case and to the collapse of the Soviet Union on the Russian side. The European Commission defines the Partnership and Cooperation Agreements as a legal framework based on respect for democratic principles and human rights, and setting out the political, economic, trade relations between the European Union and its partner countries. Each Partnership and Cooperation Agreement the European Commission continues is a 10-year bilateral treaty signed and ratified by the European Union and individual states. So several issues, in fact, flow from this definition. First of all, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement is both a political and an economic agreement. It touches upon both fields, and therefore it's a mixed agreement from the point of view of the European law. It touches upon competences of the European Union, and it touches upon the competences of a member state. Therefore, it took, in fact, more than 3 years for the European Union to ratify the agreement, because it had to be ratified not only in the European Union, but also in every individual member state of the European Union. Secondly, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement is definitely an effort to introduce some political conditionality in the agreement. And we'll talk about it in a minute, but we see that here in the definition the European Commission talks about the respect for democratic principles, human rights, and the rule of law. Thirdly, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement is not a unique Russian experience. It's an experience that many post-Soviet countries and Mongolia share together with Russia. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreements are different, in fact, and the one with Russia is probably the most developed. But the Partnership and Cooperation Agreements are in fact concluded, or were concluded in the 1990s with most post-Soviet countries. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement is also a temporary agreement. It is concluded for the period of 10 years, but then it is automatically extended every year, provided that no party declares that it doesn't want to extend it, at least 6 months before the expiration of the agreement. Yeah? So the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, for example, entered into force on the 1st of December 1997. And the point of no return for both Russia and the European Union is the 1st of June every year. Yeah? So if no party declares that it doesn't want to extend the agreement, then it is extended for another year. If we look at the structure of the EU's external relations, we will see that the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement fits somewhere in the middle. In the sense that it's not a simplistic trade agreement, it's more advanced because it provides for some legal approximation, but at the same time it's not the deepest form of cooperation. It's definitely weaker and different from the European Economic Area, not to talk about EU membership. So it's a type of cooperation, yeah, which is pragmatic, which is based on mutual pragmatic interests, also the word partnership is very interesting here, especially if you listen to one of the key classics, yeah, of the Russian studies of EU-Russian relations. Yuri Borko says that partnership, in fact, refers to a political relationship based on mutual respect of values, of the same values. So, and that brings us to the key provisions of the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement first and foremost sets out an institutional framework for EU-Russian relations. It has provisions on political dialogue, it has very detailed provisions on economic relations, yeah, particularly on trade in goods, less on services, on intellectual property rights. It has provisions on energy cooperation, but it outlines them in a very general way, and we will talk why at one of our next meetings. It talks about scientific cooperation, about legal approximation. It even foresees the possibility of launching a free trade area. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement also mentions EU standards, EU frameworks, and there is a discussion on cooperation in the field of justice and home affairs, crime prevention, a common fight against various types of crimes. In terms of the timeline, Partnership and Cooperation Agreement between Russia and the European Union was concluded in 1994. It entered into force in 1997 and it expired, or the first sort of like validity period expired in 2007. And therefore, in the run-up to the 2007, Russia started talking about a possibility of a new agreement. That didn't happen, however. Yeah. The parties started negotiating a new agreement in 2008, then the road was quite bumpy, and eventually the discussions were frozen as a result of the Ukrainian crisis in 2014. But we will talk about it later. Now let's go back to the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement is definitely an effort to create some sort of a common community of values. And therefore the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement refers extensively to values. In particular, at the beginning it is said that the parties are convinced of the paramount importance of the rule of law, respect for human rights, particularly those of minorities, the establishment of the multi-party system with free and democratic elections, and economic liberalization. Articles 1 and 2 also outline the values that Russia and the European Union promise to respect. It is important, however, that in contrast to Europe agreements, which the European Union concluded with Central and Eastern European countries, Partnership and Cooperation Agreement clearly spells that Russia still has to achieve the needed level of respect for values. So in that sense, Russia is still an unequal partner of the European Union. If you look at the relative roles of Russia and the European Union, we will see that the European Union definitely proved to be an agenda setter in many areas. Russia didn't have an experience with such type of agreements, whereas the European Union had a very developed practice of trade agreements. Moreover, Arthur Cockfield, who was in charge of the internal market, suggested that the possibility of a free trade area was inserted in the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, something that was completely new for Russia at the time. There are provisions on unilateral legal approximation, which again asymmetrically link Russia to the European Union. There are clauses on consumer protection, on intellectual property rights, on environmental cooperation, something that was quite new for Russia and something that was rather EU-driven. And institutions that Russia and the European Union set up, bilateral institutions, also reflect to a considerable extent the structure of EU institutions rather than the structure of Russian institutions. That actually led to inefficiency of some low-level institutions like committees and subcommittees. So let's turn to institutions that were set up by Russia and the European Union. First of all, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement provided for biannual summits. Russia and the European Union have to see each other at the highest level at least 2 times a year. Once in Russia, once at the EU's side. Initially, the place rotated among various country presidencies of the European Union, but following the Lisbon Treaty, most councils took place in Brussels. However, the summits, in fact, were suspended in 2014 due to the overall crisis in EU-Russian relations, and therefore we haven't had a purely EU-Russian summit since January 2014. There is a Cooperation Council, which has to meet at least once a year. In 2003, this Cooperation Council was transferred into a permanent Partnership Council, so that was meant to upgrade the level, the reputation of the Council. Then the Prime Minister and the President of the European Commission have to see each other at least once every 2 years. They actually did so much more frequently, and they sometimes brought with them commissioners and ministers, and therefore it was sort of a meeting of a big government of Russia and the European Union. There's a Cooperation Committee, which is a lower level, something that reminds us of COREPER in the European Union. And then there are 9 subcommittees. You see the list of them, ranging from trade and industry, all the way to custom and cross-border cooperation and science, technology, and human resources. And so all sorts of issues, mostly economic issues, To be honest, subcommittees stopped meeting very soon, and only one subcommittee on custom and cross-border cooperation is still in operation. There is a committee on parliamentary cooperation that brings together the State Duma on the one hand and the European Parliament on the other hand, and that's a way for members of parliaments to get together and to, in fact, exchange their legislative agenda. Clearly, Russia and the European Union do not have any judicial body, any judicial institution, and the idea is that if there is a need in such a judicial body, then this function can be exercised by either the European Court of Justice on the EU side or Russian court on the Russian side. And this is how, in fact, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement was brought into legal systems of Russia and the European Union. There are some other institutions that are important in EU-Russian relations. There is a delegation of the European Union in Moscow, which was considerably strengthened following the Lisbon Treaty. It's staffed with people from different DGs of the European Commission, from the European External Action Service, so it's the EU's basis in Russia. And then there is a Russian mission, a Russian permanent representation in Brussels, which is one of the largest representations of Russia abroad and one of the largest representations in Brussels. It's a part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it actually brings representatives from different ministries of Russia, and in that sense the Russian representation is actually an institution which coordinates the dialogue between Russia and the European Union. The head of the Russian mission to the European Union is Vladimir Chizhov. He's been in this position since 2005. He's probably the longest serving diplomat in Brussels. That's quite long, even for Brussels, although normally diplomatic appointments in Brussels are long, but in the case of Vladimir Chizhov, it's exceptionally long, so since 2005, more than 13 years by now. The general line is given by the Kremlin, but there is quite a lot of leeway in how the Russian representation exercises the technicalities of EU-Russian relations, and that's why it plays a significant role in EU-Russian relations. So wrapping up the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, we have to say that the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement established a political and legal framework for EU-Russian relations. It created a new quality of relations between Russia and the European Union, something that didn't exist before. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement also created a very stable set of institutions and a framework for both high-level dialogue and for technical contacts. Well, unfortunately, technical contacts didn't function properly and they were substituted with the dialogues, which we will talk about later. The Partnership and Cooperation Agreement established provisions for both political and economic cooperation. And Russia was more for political cooperation, being a political giant, whereas the European Union insisted on a very detailed type of economic cooperation because it was so experienced in that way, in this domain. And then, of course, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement is a cross-pillar agreement. It covers economics, politics, justice and home affairs, and even science, education, and some cultural cooperation. One case has to be mentioned, and this is the Simutenkov case. Remember that I told you that if there is a need in a judicial authority in EU-Russian relations, then a judicial authority of one of the sides takes over. And this is what happened in the case of Simutenkov, a Russian football player who lived in Spain and wanted to qualify as a national player. So he basically referred to a provision in the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement which says that any national of Russia in the European Union and of the European Union in Russia, if they are officially legal residents in Russia or in the European Union, have the right, are entitled to the very same rights as nationals of either Russia or the European Union. And the European Court of Justice analysed that provision, analysed this Article 23 of the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, and as a result concluded that yes, indeed, Timochenkov, being a Russian national, being legally employed in Spain, has a right to the same rights and obligations as national of this very country, of Spain, and therefore he qualified as a national football player. So that was a very significant result of the deliberation on the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, because for the first time in the history of Russia and the European Union, it provided immediate, direct political and legal consequences for nationals of respective countries. Technical assistance of the European Union. Remember that the program TASIS was launched in 1991, and TASIS remained operational until 2006, when it was substituted with a different program of technical assistance. Initially, the TASIS program was kept separate from the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. And initially, the idea was that if somehow developments in Russia would prove to be not in line with the EU's expectations, then the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement could have been frozen, whereas the technical assistance would have been preserved. But that didn't happen, and therefore later Russia and the European Union started thinking about joining the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement and TASIS. I'm spending a bit of attention, a bit of time on that, because if you look at Central and Eastern European countries, then Europe agreements were from the very beginning associated with the FARE, Program of Technical Assistance to Central and Eastern European countries. So in that sense, there was a profound difference between between the type of cooperation that Russia and the European Union had and the type of cooperation that the European Union established for Central and Eastern European countries. There are different types of engagements according to the TASIS program. There is a country strategy program for countrywide issues. There are regional programs that involve several countries of TASIS. There were small TASIS programs, and there were also TASIS funds to support business activities. And then the overall coordination in Russia was with the Russian Ministry of Economic Development, of Economy initially and Economic Development. So it was a type of economic assistance operated with close involvement of the Russian government. In terms of the criticism for the TASIS, several issues have to be mentioned. The first one I already referred to is the lack of coordination between the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement and TASIS that emerged initially. Later, as reforms in Russia progressed, that sort of dissociation was eliminated. Secondly, initially the TASIS projects did not involve Russian officials, Russian locals, and therefore there was some sort of a detachment between EU experts and realities on the ground. Later the problem was somehow solved, although there was a problem of equal pay, and a problem of equal pay emerged between Russian personnel on the one hand and non-Russian personnel on the other hand. There were some planning deficiencies. Again, they were due to the fact that the European Union tried to use the experience for candidate countries in the case of Russia, and that experience was not necessarily applicable. There were some implementing decisions that are clearly outlined, for example, in the review of the European Court of Auditors. So this review was conducted at the beginning of the 20th century. There were some problems with monitoring and evaluations, and Russia also criticized the fact that most of the money from TASIS projects in fact went back to the European Union, in the sense that money was used to fly in EU experts, to commission some reviews, some reports, some policy recommendations, and therefore, yes, it was technical assistance for Russia, but technical assistance which benefited to a large extent EU experts community. The TASIS program was substituted with the European Neighbourhood and Partnership Instrument in 2007. It was similar to TASIS in the sense that it was also about multi-annual planning. It drew quite extensively on the TASIS experience of decentralization, of localization, and there was some sort of a continuation with the priorities. So it was about the support for institutional, legal and administrative reform. It was support for social domain, energy and environment were pretty much in the center of the EU's attention, as well as Kaliningrad, North Caucasus, and education. At the same time, the European Neighbourhood and Partnership Instrument was different because it relied on Russia co-financing. Russia, in fact, positions itself as a country that achieved a lot during the transformation, therefore had to be treated differently. There was a significant decrease in EU funding, and there was much more local involvement compared to what we previously had in this situation. And finally, the current program that is in operation as European Neighbourhood Instrument, introduced in 2014 for the period until 2020. This instrument further reformed EU's technical assistance in the sense that there is a clear principle of more for more. The more efforts you do, the more money you can get from the European Union. There are improved provisions on cross-border cooperation, on cross-border cooperation between the European Union and its neighbors, including Russia, so that programs are implemented in an easier way, and the European Union also tries to bring some coherence between the EU's funding and the funding that it distributes outside. At the same time, Russia had to face reduced funding. On the one hand, it was due to the developments in Russia. On the other hand, it was due to the fact that a crisis in EU-Russian relations emerged. We don't have any country strategy document as of 2013 because the European Union clearly has a difficulty arriving to any of these documents given the current state of the relations. And of course, some priorities were frozen, and money mostly go to cross-border cooperation, to education and science, and to the support of civil society in Russia. So these are three priorities that are still financed. And with this overview of the technical assistance of the European Union to Russia, I wrap up our discussion on the legal and technical provisions of the relations between Russia and the European Union. And next time we will look at common spaces between Russia and the European Union.